Good evening, everyone. My name is Paul Power. I'm the CEO of the Refugee Council of Australia, and I'd like to thank you for coming along to tonight's gathering. As you can see, the theme of tonight is personal stories from 6 decades of refugee protection. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we stand, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and explain to you that in thinking about this conference, we felt it was fundamentally important to actually hear the stories of people whose lives have been changed, who've received protection during the 6 decades of the Refugee Convention. My role with the Refugee Council involves quite a bit of research into trends in refugee needs and looking at arguments for refugee protection and how to counter arguments against. If there's any statistic that anyone wants about refugee movements around the world or acceptance rates within Australia or whatever, I'm the stats nerd who can probably help you out. But ultimately, that has surprisingly little impact. In fact, one of my favourite statistics is that the federal government is going to be spending $1.15 billion on offshore asylum seeker management and detention next financial year to manage perhaps about 7,000 people coming into the country. But while I think that's a killer fact, people sort of yawn and sort of move on to the next thing. But what actually does change people's understanding of questions of refugee protection is to hear from people who've been refugees themselves. And so tonight, we've invited 6 people to come and give their story. We're waiting for the 6th to arrive, who's negotiating Sydney traffic as we speak. But people who've come over the past 60 years from different parts of the world, which in a small way represent not only the journey to Australia of people through different stages of the Australia's refugee and humanitarian program, but also give a variety of experiences which give some insight into how it is, why it is that people were forced to flee their home country and to come to Australia, and also what they've been able to do with the opportunity to begin again in Australia. Now, tonight's event is also being held in memory of Dr. Ken Rivett, who was a founding member, a founding board member of the Refugee Council of Australia and an academic at this university. So in thinking about what we could do in planning with the University of New South Wales Centre for Refugee Research and UNHCR and other organisations, we thought it was appropriate to remember Ken as a person who played a significant role in the development of immigration policy in Australia, and also played a significant role in the development of the Refugee Council. So I'll invite David Patel, who's the immediate past president of the Refugee Council of Australia, to give a little background about the man that we're remembering tonight.
Thank you, everybody. Also acknowledge the traditional owners on whose land we're meeting. It's important when you talk about refugees to acknowledge that all of us, unless we're Indigenous, in fact, came to this country, and we should acknowledge that there are traditional owners. Ken Rivett, I first met in 1984. The Refugee Council had been set up in 1981. Can people hear me? Yeah. And I remember Ken as a not so tall man with a booming voice and a passion for refugees, which was really second to none. Ken came from a very privileged family. His grandfather was a Prime Minister of Australia, Alfred Deakin. His father was a Knight of the Realm. He was, I suppose one would say, WASP and Anglo-Saxon to the bone, but his passion in life was hostility to the White Australia policy, and he wrote many papers about that in earlier years. He was a founder of the Indo-Chinese Refugee Association and was passionate in support of the the obligations of Australia to bring in refugees to better their lot, and because it was important that Australia play a role internationally. Ken was an economist, and he was an associate professor at this university, and how appropriate it is that we're meeting here and that his memory is being honoured. I always remember Ken because he was what I would consider to be an economic dry. And one of the legacies of his passion was, in talking about refugees, admit that refugees are a cost. Don't hide from that. Don't be shy to say that, but say that we have an obligation. And Ken just, sorry, Paul just spoke of just gave a statistic which is horrific when you think of it. If we're prepared to spend that sort of money keeping people out, how about spending a little bit of that money to assist people to do the right thing? I can remember years ago that this is not new, that these sorts of huge figures are being spent. The amount that Australia contributes to UNHCR is trivial when you look at the amount that's being spent on border protection. But that's probably the subject of a debate or a discussion that's going to take part during the course of the program. One of the things which Ken was involved with during his life was the establishment of the Centre for Refugee Research that is the primary organiser of this function. And I can remember the discussions at the time when he and Eileen and others were talking about the creation of a centre which he wanted to be at this university. Ken died in 2004, and we were saddened at his departure. The Refugee Council resolved that we were supposed to have biannual speeches or orations in his honour. That's a little bit fallen by the wayside, but I think it's more appropriate than having just a rather dry oration to have a function like this, a celebration of the very people that Ken throughout his life worked to help. One final thing I'll say about Ken. Excuse me. During his period with the Refugee Council, we set up the Australian Refugee Foundation. And the purpose of the foundation was to provide a secure funding base for the council so that we wouldn't be dependent on government and other largesse for support. We would be independent. Ken was a man of his word, because when he died, he left the vast bulk of his rather sizable estate to the foundation. And it's through Ken and his friends, because he also encouraged his friends to leave legacies to the foundation, that the foundation largely has accumulated a significant amount, not as much as we would like, but nevertheless a significant amount, which will ensure the continuation of the council for as long as will be necessary, which regrettably will be too long. So I think those are enough words from me. Actually, there was a speech which was prepared, but I'm not reading it. But it's on, or it will be on the council's website for anybody who wants to know a little bit more about Ken Rivett, whose memory we honour. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Since Federation, Australia has received more than 750,000 refugees, and both the vast majority of them have been resettled from other places, but there's also been tens of thousands of people who've been recognised as refugees within Australia. And in fact, it's only within the last 2 years, according to our best calculations at the Refugee Council, that Australia passed the 750,000 mark. So in the past 60 years since the signing of the Refugee Convention, the number of people who've received refugee protection in Australia is somewhere around 680 or 690,000. So there are many, many people in Australian society who've come to this country originally because they were forced to flee situations in their home country, and there are many, many more who are direct descendants or directly related to people of refugee background. So, and we have a number of them with us tonight. So we'll begin with the 1950s, and in fact we have two people who came during the 1950s. The period between 1947 and the late 1950s was in fact a period where the greatest number of refugees, displaced people, came to Australia predominantly from Central and Eastern Europe. And so our first speaker tonight is Andrew Havis, who came to Australia in 1957 from Hungary.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Paul. I too would like to acknowledge the Eora Nation, which are the traditional owners of this land that we are on today. Friends, what is a refugee? The dictionary definition is an exile who flees for safety. That is exactly what my family and I were. I was 7.5 at the outbreak of the Hungarian Revolution on the 23rd of October 1956. A terrible year for Hungarians. There were 3 major disasters that year. To begin, there was a magnitude 5.8 earthquake with the epicentre right where I lived and my family lived, in a place called Dunaharaszti. But I will get to that and relate how we came to be living there shortly, because that is a complete story on its own. The second disaster was a major flood of the Danube River, and whose banks we also lived. And the third, of course, was the Hungarian Revolution. To go back and give you a little bit of insight into my family background, I need to share with you, the audience, the fact that my father lost his first wife, and my mother, aged 26, lost her first husband, 29, during the Holocaust. My parents married after the war, and I was born in 1949. My grandfather was a wealthy man. He was a prominent Hungarian furniture manufacturer. The communist regime did not tolerate people who were wealthy. And when I was 2 years old, we were deported to that little village that I mentioned called Dunaharaszti. There we stayed until we escaped to Australia in 1956. Just a little bit of background and a bit of history. At this time, the Iron Curtain prevented free movement of people between countries and even cities. My father was desperately trying to get us out of Hungary as early as 1952, as he recognised that we had no future in this communist country. So, when the Hungarian Revolution broke out, he seized the opportunity to escape. The US funded Radio Free Europe, the UN and others offered assistance if the Hungarians were to take up arms against the Soviet-backed communist regime. Spurred on by those words of support, the Hungarians rose up heroically on the 23rd of October 1956. However, assistance from the West never came. Hungarians have for years resented the West for this failure to live up to their offer. Memories of the 1956 Hungarian Revolution come flooding back. In Budapest, street-by-street gun battles against Soviet tanks lasting less than 2 weeks before the revolt was snuffed out. The Hungarian toll was quite remarkable, and when I did a little bit of research, 2,700 killed, 20,000 injured, 35,000 buildings destroyed, and 200,000 refugees, including my parents and me. The crushing of the revolt resulted in the biggest mass exodus of Hungarians. The aftermath of the 1956 Hungarian Revolution was marked by mass arrests, show trials, executions, and long prison terms. The exodus tore families apart as people fled to different countries. Most separating families had no means of coming together again. For us, we had the hard decision to make: do we leave my 64-year-old grandmother, who has lived with us all her life, behind or not? Having assessed the situation, we decided that it was not viable for her to come with us at the time. The actual escape from Hungary to Austria is a total another story, and time does not permit me to tell you the full story. However, I just want to share a few important points. During the escape, we were shot at. 2 people in our party were killed. We had to hide in freezing snow for hours until I couldn't feel my hands and feet. And being 7, I had to walk in the snow was so high that I actually had to walk in the wake of my father or my parents because of the how big it was. The journey took us 2 days, and as you can imagine, when we finally crossed into Austria at the bridge at Andau, we were absolutely elated. I will never forget the kindness and the generosity displayed by the Austrians to us Hungarian refugees. On October the 26th, Austrian Interior Minister Oskar Helmer announced that every Hungarian refugee would be granted political asylum. The West's inaction left governments with a feeling of guilt. Subsequently, Hungarian refugees were welcomed with open arms to the West. However, very strict quota systems were imposed by most of the countries. In Austria, we endured several months at a refugee camp in Salzburg, but at least we were safe. You might well ask, why Australia? We applied to Canada, USA, and Australia to take us in. My mother's brother, Tibor, was already in Australia, so we thought we'd have a much better chance to get a permit to immigrate here. And that is exactly what happened. But additionally to that, in my parents' case, Australia was preferred as it was as far away from troubled Europe as you could possibly go. And I think a lot of people have thought that with Europeans and elsewhere. After a long and grueling wait, which seemed like forever, in March 1957, 5 months after our application, we were accepted, subject to medical examination. This was seen by my parents as another major hurdle, as my father had some heart problems, and he was terrified that we will not be accepted for that particular reason. Well, I have to share with you, I can still feel the relief, even though I was only 7 at the time, when finally, after a long wait, the news came that we were accepted, and we had a passage on a ship called the Fair Sea to depart from Bremerhaven, Germany, to Australia. Now, you've got to imagine that the Fair Sea was a converted troop ship with no cabins, just big open spaces with triple-decker bunks, so cramped that one could not even sit upright. Men were assigned to one section, women to another. The toilets and shower facilities were one long open block, and everywhere you went, there was an awful reek of bleach and phenol. People threw up because of the smell, not just the swell. I did not see my parents for most of the 5 weeks journey, as they spent most of their time below decks being seasick. We landed in Melbourne on the 26th of May, 1957. Took a train to Sydney, where we were given £50 by the Welfare Society to commence our lives, and we were let free. My father took a job as a storeman in a wool factory. My mother went out to do some cleaning. Now, I have to again share with you that this is a lady who had servants of her own back in Hungary. We lived in King's Cross in Victoria Street, above a pub, on the 3rd floor of a terrace cottage in one room. Boy, living in King's Cross pub, above a King's Cross pub in the 50s was a definite education, I have to share with you. I went to the local primary school, which was Darlinghurst Public, which would have had to be one of the worst schools in Sydney at the time. I was the only non-English speaking kid. As a result, there was never a day in my life I wasn't called a wog, or that I was not ridiculed because I bought my salami sandwiches, or because I wore proper school uniform, while most kids wore thongs, no ties and a t-shirt, which was definitely not the prescribed school uniform. My parents insisted that I have to go to school looking spick and span in my Sunday best. But actually, thinking back on it, interestingly, I believe that this has made me a better person. These days, we will be talking about bullying, taking action, or even suing. And I feel that I'm a much stronger person and more tolerant person as a result. 2 years later, we moved out of the terrace house in Victoria Street. After a lot of blood, sweat and tears and hard work, my parents managed to save enough money to be able to put a small deposit down on a semi-cottage in Waverley, where we lived for the next 10 years. My mother established herself as a confectionery manufacturer's agent, importing European chocolates like Lindt into Australia, and my father later joined the business. My mother passed away aged 95, and until she was 77, when she stopped working in the business that she had found in 1959. In my youth, I was very involved in Habanim, which is a Jewish youth organisation, taking groups of even younger kids on camps and in weekly group meetings. The vast majority of my friends, even today, 47 years later, are all from that particular era. I was able to learn many, many new skills from my involvement, which even today I use. I believe I'm very patriotic about Australia. Not I believe, I am very patriotic about Australia and love a way of life. I wanted to pay back to the country that gave my parents and me a freedom and accepted us. As a result, in 1967, I joined the Australian Army 1st Royal New South Wales Regiment, and it happened to be the Commandos, and then I joined the SAS, the Special Air Services. Having served initially for a period of 6 months, I was told that because I came from a communist country, and since I still had relatives in Hungary at that time, I was a military threat. I couldn't be in the Signal Corps, I couldn't be in military police, and several other parts of the service. And at that time, it was the worst possible thing that Australia had ever done to me. I felt extremely hurt by that and very, very upset. I married Melissa in 1975. I have 2 children, Mark and Simon's sitting in the second row there, both of whom are married. I am now what is called retired, but seem to be busier than when I was working. This is after a career spanning 38 years in Telstra and IBM, working mainly in various senior managerial capacities. Initially, I joined the PMG in 1968. I've held many roles as an executive within the IT and telecommunication sectors, both in IBM and Telstra, covering key areas of strategic analysis and implementation of large-scale change. In 1996, I joined a Jewish service organisation called B'nai B'rith and was the founding president of a new unit named after Sid Einfeld, a politician who assisted many, many migrants and refugees immigrating to Australia after World War II. Subsequently, I became the president of B'nai B'rith New South Wales for 2 terms, spanning 4 years. B'nai B'rith is an international Jewish service organisation which is represented in 50 countries with NGO consultative status at the United Nations since its inception. I'm very proud that I have established and am founding chairperson of Courage to Care, a travelling exhibition which aims to inform and educate Australians of the dangers of prejudice and discrimination. The program combats bullying and racism by empowering the individual to make a difference and teach one not to be a bystander. Courage to Care has been seen by 168,000 people, including 68,000 school children who have attended a 2-hour anti-bullying, anti-racism workshop right throughout Australia. In 2009, I received the Medal of the Order of Australia, OAM, for services to the community through promoting cultural diversity and understanding. I'm involved and have worked with numerous communal boards, organisations for the past 16 years in various capacities. My motto, people who say it cannot be done should not interrupt those that are doing it. And I think we're all... One might ask what it means to be safe in Australia. I believe in Australia you live under the protection of the law, not in fear of it. Where in more repressive regimes, people live in fear. Here, the freedom of people is guaranteed under the law. People are generally not in fear of the knock at the door in the small hours of the morning. Australia has given me the opportunity to be whatever I want to be, regardless of my financial situation or social status. I have opportunities to study, freedom of association, freedom to express my views, and a bloody good way of life. Most Australians share an immigrant heritage, living and embracing difference. The fact is that 52% of Australians were born overseas or have a parent who was born overseas. Despite this, as a nation, we've become less tolerant of those in our society who are different, those who profess a different lifestyle, are of a different race, religion, or cultural background, or who profess different values from that of the mainstream Australia. I believe there is absolutely no place for divisiveness, discrimination, or racism, attitudes which must be rejected. We are the world's most socially harmonious society, and we must remain that way. Thank you, Australia.
Thank you very much for that, Andrew. And yeah, I'm sure the people who saw this young boy going to Darlinghurst Public School with his salami sandwiches in 1957.
Yeah. I went around the corner and I used to take it all off because all the chips were covered. My phone's only from my back. My hair is completely placed.
Yes. Well, none of the people who saw you at that time would realise the contribution that you'd make to this country over the following 50 years. And I think that's very much the theme of tonight, as well as a theme of some research which will be launched on Friday by the Immigration Minister, Chris Bowen, on the economic, social and civic contributions of refugees to Australian society. So, but here we have some personal examples of people who've contributed greatly to this country. The second person on our panel tonight is Natalie Lobostov, or Lobastova, who was born in Asia. So I suppose in a sense she's a refugee from Asia, but too, her family fled twice from the excesses of the Soviet Union, and she came to Australia not in the 1960s but also in 1957, a little later than Andrew, but in the same year, from a different but closely connected situation. So I'll hand over to Natalie.
If I could just mention that I had very short notice to prepare it. I accepted a couple of days ago, so my speech isn't that long. Okay. I was born in the city of Harbin, China, to Russian parents. Harbin was established and built by Russians. Back in 1896, Tsarist Russia and China had a good neighborly relationship and agreed to build the extension to Trans-Siberian Railway, called Chinese Eastern Railway, mainly for trade purposes. In Harbin, there were Russian schools, theaters, universities, and 25 Russian Orthodox churches. So this is my background, Russian heritage and Orthodox religion. When China became communist, Chinese government told the foreigners that China is for Chinese, so we had to flee. Russia was under communism, so we could not go to Russia. I was 12 months old when the Soviet army entered China and took thousands, mainly men, and my godmother was included in that, very few women, to concentration camps. There, because they were living outside of Russia, Soviet Union, they were regarded as traitors, so they were taken directly to concentration camps. I did get the files from my father, what he went through, and he died very shortly after he was taken, because no food, no warm clothing, and they were falling trees back in very coldest part of Siberia. So my father and my uncles were included in that. World Council of Churches came to our aid. They paid for our fare to Australia, which my mother repaid fully after working for a while. My mother's life in Australia was very difficult. Back in China, she was teaching Russian at the university in Harbin. Arriving in Australia, not knowing English, with very few services available. In those days, she worked in factories, she worked as a cleaner at the hospital. But she was grateful her children would have a brighter future. I arrived in Australia, in Brisbane, at the age of 12, not speaking a word of English. I was placed in a primary school. I was the only non-English speaking. They looked at me, you know, must be stupid if you don't speak by the age of 12. I went to, so no support was provided, no classes in those days. I just sat there. Saturdays, I went to Russian school. After a few weeks, I left the English school and I went to work in a factory where they made Hessian bags. I was there for a few weeks. One of the questions that was asked at the beginning before accepting me to work there, they said, "Can you count to 25? Yes, I could. A few weeks later, because they were sticking Hessian bags in lots of 25. After a few weeks later, my Russian school teacher took me by the hand and she said, "You're not working at the factory, you must go back to school." So she enrolled me to a school in a different suburb where a little more attention was given to me. I still have a book about an Aboriginal boy, which I translated word for word into Russian, and I started studying. I completed Russian school, then went to Cavendish Road High School, there is a lady from Brisbane here, and started my job as a bookkeeper. A little later, I moved to Sydney. I met my future husband, who's also from a Russian background from Harbin. After the marriage, we lived with his parents and saved madly because both of us wanted to travel, go to Russia, see Russia. Then we did travel. We traveled for 9 months. In those days, you could do it for a very modest amount. Then we had 2 children. I brought them up bilingual. That was not easy in 70s. I remember even a teacher at my daughter's primary school asked me one day, "What is more important to you? Is it English or Russian?" My response was, both. I'm surprised to hear that from an educated person. Both languages are very important. If you have 2 languages, 2 cultures, the person is that much richer. When the children became older, I went back to part-time office work, which I found very repetitive and monotonous. Having the first-hand knowledge of difficulties in a new country, I enjoyed helping other people. I sat for an exam and obtained my NATI accreditation as an interpreter in Russian language. About the same time, I was invited to participate in establishing the Russian Ethnic Community Council of New South Wales. I am one of the foundation members, and I'm still on the board 17 years on. One of the purposes is to assist newly arrived, to assist the elderly people, much the same as other national groups do. Realizing how little I knew about government structures and welfare, I went to TAFE to study community services, welfare, Certificate 3 at 4 at Granville TAFE. And then a little later, I continued my studies at Macquarie University, and I majored, got the Bachelor of Arts majoring in Russian. And the same year, my daughter Marina graduated from Sydney University. So I was very much, as my husband says, mature age student. But Marina now she worked in Sydney University, then she moved to Canberra for 2.5 years, and just recently she got promotion and she moved to Tasmanian University. And she works as a manager of online learning services, which she enjoys. This last week, she did a very short, exciting job as an interpreter. She's also accredited. They held a hair expo at Hilton. A Russian hairdresser extraordinaire was there, and she was invited to be his interpreter, which she enjoyed very much. I worked as a volunteer interpreter at Sydney Olympic Games together with my daughter. And that was great experience, absolutely great. For the last 15 years, I have been working as interpreter at Sydney West Area Health, Sydney Southwest Area Health, and Centrelink. This job has great satisfaction. I enjoy it immensely. For my community work in 1998, I was awarded a medal from the Archbishop Hilarion of the Russian Orthodox Church abroad. Last year, I was nominated for the Australian of the Year 2000. My nomination was accepted. I didn't win any bigger awards. In conclusion, I would like to say that we are very fortunate to live in a wonderful country, Australia. I am a supporter of a multicultural organization called Thank You Australia. Their motto is, there is a time for everything. There is a time to say, thank you, Australia.
Thank you very much, Natalie. Our next panellist came from the next group of refugees to come to Australia, the people who came from Latin America after the ill wind of political change swept through a number of countries in that part of the world. So Lucy Marin came from Chile in 1976, so here's her story.
Thank you, and good evening, everyone. I think we're going to show a little bit of a photo of the map, just to have an idea where South America, I hope everyone knows where Latin America is. It's very right at the south of South America, so there it is. Chile is a very small, thin country there, hardly for me at the time. I think it's a bit better near. But I would like to thank the Refugee Council of Australia and Centre for Refugee Research of University of New South Wales for inviting me to participate on this conference and share my refugee life experience, looking to the future, learning from the past, roots and identity. Well, my name is Lucy Marin. I'm a mother, I'm a grandmother, I'm a wife, and I also work as a counselor as intake assessment team at STARTS for the last 21 years of my life at the Service for the Rehabilitation of Torture and Trauma Survivors. I was one of the pioneers at the center there. I was born during the 50s and in a small city called Rancagua, which is located about 80 km south from the capital of Santiago, in the Kingdom of Chile, the country that is right at south atmosphere in Latin America. That was the day when I was actually got married and then taking the plane to Australia with my little boy who is now 36 years of age. Exactly the day. I was the only child. My mother was 40 years old when I was born, and she was working as chemistry and very dedicated to her career. My father was a mechanic and worked for a national electricity company. He was a very good father, very supportive with a lot of friends, very calm, always ready to help people in need, and he was a person to have fun. Because of my father's work, he always needed to move along the country as a commissioner on duties for the company, and for me not to change schools all the time. I did my studies, primary and secondary, in a Catholic schools. I'm from Catholic family beliefs. I'm not that Catholic anymore, but I'm still Catholic. I just go to church when I need to take care of my sins. But my mother doesn't know anymore that I'm doing this anymore. And half of my schooling, I was in a boarding school, seeing then my parents only weekends. Such are the ironies of this world that for some reason I used to love English language. I didn't know, now I know why. And I also remember my father saying that I should learn English well, that one day you must use it. You never know. And for this reason, my best marks were in English and not as good in Spanish grammar. Still no good, but in both. My English and my Spanish grammar is not that good. I had beautiful memories and experiences that I'm showing you part of my family. I'm coming from a very musical family. We're still very musical. That is the therapy that we use to survive better. I'll tell you later. And I had very, very, very beautiful memories, experiences, and people that they were in my life due to my mother's family, political involvement and friendships, like Pablo Neruda. I was very small, 7, 8 years of age when I met Pablo, Don Pablo. Salvador Allende, the Chilean president in 1973. Of my childhood and my adolescent era, with my parents, family, and friends, that if do not narrate this event of my life with rigor and harmony, I lose the horizon. I actually married on the 15th of September 1973, 4 days after the military coup. I was a psychology student at the Catholic University. Again, a good girl should go to a Catholic school, Catholic University. And my husband, Oscar, a student of industrial engineering at the University of Technology. We both thought of continuing with our studies, but it didn't happen. It all finished there. On our wedding day, and 4 hours before the wedding, my husband was taken to prison by the police. But the priest, who knew us since we were little, was able to free him. At the party, police came with machine guns and stopped the party because it was illegal. You could not be happy at the time. From this day on, our life and thousands of Chileans' lives were living in limbo. We found our friends' bodies in the rivers. My mother's family, who some of them were parliament representatives, disappeared or killed. I can only believe that they are in heaven, and I had experiences of taking me off from public buses for investigation, for possible connection with those family members because of my surname at the time. From 1973 to 1975, Chile was absolutely in control under the military coup in all different aspects. And this was the year that my first baby was born, Cesar. C-E-S-A-I, not C-E-A, C-E-S-A-I, the one that is 36 years of age now. The years of insecurity, fears, sadness, silence, and blindness. Chilean citizens could not see or comment in anything because could not trust anyone. My life changed enormously. After years of happiness and surrounded by people that loves you, they are not there anymore. I felt that I went into this extraterrestrial world, and I felt that roots were not that strong as before. We, the family, did not have the Sundays together, singing, laughing, and sharing stories. I went in isolation, mute, blind, and I lost part of my identity, which is very Latin American culture to be pretty happy on Sundays. We still do that. We have a good barbecue, glass of wine, and we sing and laugh. In 1976, 3 years after the military coup, we approached different embassies in Santiago. But my father was very worried about us and started to encourage us to leave the country for a few years until everything went back to normal. My husband and I had a baby, and we also fears for our life. We approached different embassies in Santiago and requested to consider our applications and begging to get out of the country for fears. And I remember going to the Canada, Brazil, Venezuela, and Australian embassy. A few months later, we were accepted to come to Australia, and the letter that we received said, "Please prepare yourself to travel to Australia. But please keep this information extremely confidential," fears again, "and you have 60 days for your journey." On the same day, I called my father to come to visit me, and I wanted to share this great news. He was happy and told me that soon him and my mother will reunite with us in Australia. But he went back home to tell my mother the news, and the next morning, 5 o'clock in the morning, my father had a heart attack and passed away. At that time, I was not sure if I should come to Australia at this stage and leave my mother behind with so many losses. I was the only child. My husband, Oscar, is also the only child. Could you believe it, that we look for people to do it? And his mother was under very similar circumstances. We were extremely confused, but I remember my father's words: leave this country to be safe and live with dignity. And we did promise in my mother and my mother-in-law that they both will be with us soon. It did happen. 9 months later, they were here. So I arrived in Australia in August 1976 with my husband, my little baby, Caesar, who was a year and a half, and 3 luggages, one for each of us, and another one big luggage of sadness, resentment, losses, and trauma. We arrived at the Villawood Hostel. At the arrival, I understood my father and why he insisted me to learn English, thinking that it was good, my English, but no. No. At arrival, I could not identify faces, smell, flowers. The transport was on the other side, the sadness, but everyone was sad at the hostel. My best therapy at the time was I used to invite people from Spanish-speaking background, most of them refugees, to sing. I used to play the guitar. I still play the guitar, and I teach art and help them to learn a little bit of English, the probably 100 words that I knew in English at the time, to share with them. The challenge of surviving another day and keeping the moral high filled us with energies was a very difficult and painful experience. A few months later, I consulted with a career counselor and commenced my studies. And later, I started working with different fields, until I was able to do what I believed is also part of my role in this world. In 1982, my second child was born, Steve, 29 years of age. In 1985, I started working at the Fairfield Migrant Resource Center as a grantee night worker. One of the old workers, remember those positions? They were very difficult settlement workers. There you go. Assisting refugee families from Latin and Central America in the area of settlement. In 1990, I commenced at STARS as a bicultural counselor, where I have been working until today, and happy to work in the field that I can contribute not only from a personal level, as well as contemplating my own experiences. Thank you for that, thank you. I could only go back to Chile, 14 years later for first time, with a lot of fears in my life. I wasn't sure if I was gonna come back to Australia. I can only say that through these 34 years of my life in Australia, I've been able to achieve a number of experiences that fulfill my life and the life of my family. Caesar, 36, my first child, is a father of a beautiful little girl that she's probably going to a PV, very happy, and a very successful psychology and a musician, and always involved in working with the refugees and STARS as well, with camps of kids at STARS. Steve, 29, a professional and successful musician as well, and very warm young man and about to get married. My roots and identity are always balanced by my 2 countries that I adore, Chile and Australia. And I could say that I'm a happy refugee. I'm able to feel, I'm a happy refugee, I'm lost. I'm able to feel again the color of the mountains, the sounds of the waterfalls, and I enjoy having our lunches now on Sundays in Australia with my family, listening to the music from those days, singing together songs that can make us feel that our roots mix with the 2 experiences and express our support, understanding, and love to each other. We are a musical family, and the music is part of our survival, up to the level that we recorded a CD called The Marin Family and Their Music, 34 years of musical journey. Thank you very much.
It's such a privilege to hear these stories, so thank you for sharing it, and really appreciate the stories also are difficult stories to tell. Our next panellist is from the single largest group of refugees to come to Australia, refugees from Vietnam who began coming to Australia in 1976. So Marin Tran came in 1982 as part of the group of 150,000 people who have in many ways transformed Australian society and certainly made a big... it's interesting, you know, that we're remembering Ken Rivett tonight, because Ken was a major figure in the push for an open and multicultural Australia and overturning the White Australia policy. And I think, you know, for many of us who were born in the country, the experience of the settlement of Vietnamese was, in many ways, our first full-scale contact with people, you know, from well outside Europe. And so we're really pleased to have Marin Tran as part of that group of trailblazers, you know, who came to Australia in the late 1970s and early 1980s.
Thank you. Wow, you know, you guys are amazing. I just feel like I'm so small. I just feel like I've only been in Australia for a very short period of time. Anyways, just to start my story, I was born in 1971 and was only 6 years old when the Vietnamese communist regime sent 5 officials to live in our house in Saigon. And their job there was to monitor, intimidate and threaten us in order to get my parents to disclose and hand over their wealth to the communists. During this time, Mum went into depression and Dad felt helpless and was unable to. We were forced out of our house and were left homeless in Saigon. And at that time, we had a family of 6 with 4 kids under the age of 10. Fortunately, my grandparents had a small pineapple farm on the southern coast of Vietnam and offered us a place to stay. They converted their barn into a temporary home for us, and we stayed there for 4 years. Having lost our possessions, livelihood, and dignity, my parents planned our escape. Part of the escape plan consists of lots of adult conversations in which I was not privy to, but I saw my parents handing over gold plates and I thought, oh, something was going on there. Perhaps that was part of the process of paying for our trip, which my parents had earned when they were in Saigon. So in 1982, I was woken up in the middle of the night. I was led to the seaside and got into an old fishing boat that was about 10 meters long and less than 2 meters wide. And there were 45 other people that were put into that fishing boat on that night. A few men stayed on top of the boat to give the appearance of a normal fishing boat. This is just a way of deterring other, attracting pirates and coming to the boat. So while the rest of us were packed like sardines in the hull, it was hot and wet sitting in the hull. People vomited from seasickness and our bodies were soaked in salt water which was mixed with the vomit. And even though Mum seemed to be the quiet person in the family, to me she's the smartest person of all when it comes to planning to survive. You see, she always had a plan. One of the plans that she had, which I remember, was that she painted her diamond jewelry in pink nail polish. And she asked me to wear them. She wanted to wear these because she knew that if we were attacked by pirates, they would take jewelry worn by adults and not by kids. And I was really proud to wear those pair of earrings. And when we arrived and landed at one of the beaches in Malaysia, I saw people running, screaming and jumping off the boat because the waves then was really high and it was only a few more minutes before the boat will break into pieces. So I don't know how I got off the boat, but I got off the boat then. When we got off the boat, we were greeted by the locals there. They were very nice towards us. They gave us food and overnight accommodation. The next day, we were transported by boat to an island called Pulau Bidong in Malaysia. Pulau Bidong was a refugee camp, and I was told that we had to wait there for a while. as I was easing life into life on an island, I started to like living there. It was not a resort, but it was great. No schools, no rules, and I was free to roam wherever I like and know what barbed wire is. Dad enjoyed his fishing, and he enjoys watching us eating his catch, and he still fishes today as well. Mum, she was able to sell the remaining of the catch to other refugees and saved enough money to start a small business and by selling homemade desserts when we were on the island. So approximately 6 months later, we were chosen to meet with an Australian interviewer. We were told that Aussie interviewers were more strict and do not accept people into their country easily. Therefore, to be accepted, we had to be on our good behaviour. That means we had to smile a little and no fighting with my siblings when we were being interviewed. A few weeks later, we received news that we would go to Australia and were then transferred to another camp on the mainland called Sunga, BC. So we stayed there for about a month before we were scheduled to leave for Australia. So we arrived in Australia in December 1982, and we actually arrived at Coogee and stayed at the Endeavour Hostel, which I think is knocked down by now. And even though we were well looked after, deep down, I still wanted a place of our own, a place where we could eat rice with smelly prawn paste, and I'm not sure if you had that before. So within a few months of living in the hostel, we moved to a rented home, a 2-bedroom house. St. Vinny's helped us with basic household items such as blankets, mattresses, second-hand plates, and I was really ecstatic with the goodies that were sent to the home. I was just looking forward to more goodies from St. Vinny's then. From there, I started school in Year 5 in Burwood. It was during the school years that I started to experience racism from other non-Asian students. I was used to people calling us ching-chongs, or Asians, go back to where you came from, or that I would be spat on by hooligans walking home from school. When I completed high school and got accepted to study at this university, I found love on campus, and my husband's sitting right there. Then I completed high school and got accepted. Completed high school. Then I worked at the Commonwealth Bank part-time on this campus too while I was studying here. And when I completed my studies in 1995, I started work with Westpac Bank. In 1997, my husband decided to move to Singapore to gain more exposure, working experience as an architect, so I had to follow him. Well, not that I had to, but I thought, okay, I'll try. So I started my career from scratch in Singapore as a HR assistant, and from there I've moved into HR regional manager roles. In the year 2003, we moved back to Sydney because we had 2 kids, so we thought it was time to come back home. And it was then that I decided it was time also for me to bring back, to give something back to the community, a community that has helped us so much when we came to Australia. So when I came back here, looking for work was difficult, but in the end, it took me about a year before I sort of found the job I like. And so I started with a few casual jobs when I came back to Sydney, and then after that I found work at Anglicare. And from there I managed to develop my roles into regional, deputy regional manager role. And during my time at Anglicare, I also managed to look into opportunities for to help people coming from cold and linguistically diverse backgrounds to find employment, because I know what it's like, to find employment when you're a skilled person, and just imagine when you are not skilled and can't speak the language, it would be a whole lot more difficult. So while I was working in Anglicare, you know, I came across some of the mothers and newborn migrants who have home care skills. And so I thought, great, you know, this community, you know, is getting older. We do have sort of aging people in our community, and they really needed help in the home. So I started with a few ideas and run through management with my business plans. And so Anglicare accepted the plan, and we started implementing the plan. And the plan was to recruit people come from culturally and linguistically diverse background, which I call cold backgrounds. And we help them to to get them some experience and also find employment through the work that I do. And then in there, you know, well, that's when I sort of realized that not only that these people are talented people and they can speak another language, but at the same time, they are able to help our growing community over here, and that's the kind of need that the community, need that the community need. But so yeah, so today I have over 60 people coming from different backgrounds working with us within the Southwest region. And so now I'm actually looking into expanding the business into other parts of Sydney and to try and find those talents out there trying to find employment but having difficulties. So that's my story so far, really, as a refugee making a difference in Australia. And to me, Australia will always be home. So that's it.
Thank you. Thank you for your story. I'm not sure that Nazifa has been able to make it. No, she hasn't. No. Okay. She definitely left home and was on her way here, but obviously wasn't able to find the venue. So our last panellist tonight is a representative of the tens of thousands of refugees who arrived in the last decade, Atem, who's from Sudan.
I'm going to stand if that's all right. I was born in South Sudan and moved with my dad, mom, and sister and brother to Khartoum, the capital of Sudan. My dad worked as an accountant in Saudi Arabia and made a good income. I learned to speak Arabic very well. I went to a good school where I was the only South Sudanese. I didn't know that I was different, as I spoke Arabic like everybody else, and my family was well off. I noticed, though, that I was darker than everybody else at school. I was the top of my class always. I noticed that some teachers were not happy with this, but that didn't mean anything to me. I played with my Arab friends from school and from the neighborhood. My dad believed that South Sudanese had been denied equality and justice for a long time, and the only way Sudanese people could live in harmony and peace in Sudan would be through a political change, even if it meant going to war. So we ended up in Ethiopia, in Itang refugee camp. Itang refugee camp was located in western Ethiopia in the border with Sudan. Itang was the Sudan's People Liberation Army headquarters, and the Sudanese People Liberation Army is the SPLA, if some of you are following events in Sudan. Officially, Kakuma refugee camp was run by the UNHCR. In practice, it was the SPLA that provided security and administered the camp, including food distribution. Itang refugee camp was highly militarized, and it was the norm to see soldiers in full military gear patrolling the streets. SPLA commanders visited Itang on a regular basis. We as children were amazed when the SPLA commander-in-chief was visiting. There were soldiers and soldiers swarming the refugee camp. We would stand along the road waiting to see Dr. John. We would wait for an hour before we see him. The soldiers the soldiers carried weapons we had never seen before. We would talk about them and try to work them out. We saw children of our age carrying guns. They walked proudly in uniform, and all the girls loved them. We were all always under pressure on such occasions to go and train, if only our families would let us. Dr. John would make the point of talking to us kids. He told us that we were the future of Sudan, and that the war that is being fought was to free Sudan from the Arab domination. We were told that the Arab is the enemy and must be defeated. We were told that we would be the leaders of tomorrow, and that we should work hard at school and serve the community, because leaders must work for the people. We were so excited that we were to lead tomorrow, and that we had a task ahead of us. Many of us had to build houses and fences for the community. This meant going into the forest to cut grass and wood for the SPLA officers to build their houses. There was always tension in Itang. The Nuer and the Dinka had always argued over power. The Dinka thought they were the most civilized and educated. The Nuer loved power and saw the Dinka as an oppressive people who took what is rightly theirs. On one occasion, the Dinka and Nuer soldiers clashed. There were gunshots, and for the rest of that night, the camp was transformed into a war zone. There was also tension between us, the refugees, and the local people, especially the Anuak. The Anuak lived on the western side of the Baro River, and we, the refugees, settled on the eastern side of the Baro River. It was not clear why we clashed with the Anuak. I remember the 3-day clashes between us and them that cost the life of a few individuals. Then Mengistu lost power in Ethiopia, and our Ethiopian friends turned against us. All Sudanese people had to evacuate the refugee camps in Ethiopia, though some came back to the camp shortly after that. However, the large majority walked back to Sudan. The war was nasty, and the walk continued for months before arriving in Kenya. Kakuma refugee camp was opened. We used to hear about Kenya in Itang. It was the place to become educated. We read Kenyan textbooks in Ethiopia at school in English. When I arrived in Kakuma refugee camp, I could not write Arabic anymore. I could still speak it, but not so well. My English was getting better and replacing Arabic. There was no need to hold on to the language of the enemy. Kakuma was a weird place. It was hot and dusty. There was wind and dust all the time. I came to Kakuma to go to school. I joined the only class 7 that was available. The UNSCR was funding education in the camp through some Kenyan NGO. The schools started under trees. Just imagine sitting on dirt in an area infested with deadly scorpions, and the wind blowing dust everywhere. The World Food Organization was in charge of food, and from time to time, the UNHCR withheld food so that refugees behaved. We didn't have food for weeks. On one occasion, because a UNHCR store was broken into, and equipment and books worth millions of Kenyan shillings were looted. The UNHCR decided that it was our fault and that there was no food for anyone until the culprits were handed over to the Kenyan police. The UNHCR was brutal to refugees in Kakuma. They built a massive compound that was accessible to UNHCR and NGO staff only. They had air-conditioned offices and nice residents. I couldn't believe that there was a massive swimming pool in the UNHCR compound until I went there. Water is rationed in the camp, but not at UNHCR compound. We were told that there was donor fatigue, and that is why refugees were not receiving enough food, including water. Refugee teachers and staff were not paid their monthly incentives. It was at this same time the UNHCR was putting up a massive new compound. I then arrived in Australia. It was so exciting because I hoped that all was going to go well. In the camp, we were told Australians were good people. We were told that we would be offered a house and a free wife. We were told that you could study or work or do whatever you want. We were told when you turn on the water tap, you could choose by a push of a button what flows out: cold water, hot water, alcohol, coffee, tea, you name it. The first shock for us was housing. There were no free houses waiting for us. I was sharing a room for 5 weeks after arrival with 3 others. Everything was strange, and when you spoke to anyone, the response was, "Can you say that again?" How rude. It was also confusing. Then there were the stories of the mistreatment of the indigenous people, and the stories of the boat people. I learned that the boat people were queue jumpers. Australia was a big monster. I felt confused and betrayed. I decided to go to uni to drown my miseries and disappointment. I couldn't communicate to anyone at uni for a while, but I held on. I was able to charm some ladies who saw beyond my skin and accent. They thought I understood chemistry 1A better than they did, and so worked with them. That was a relief. At least I had something to offer. At least in this environment, people can see beyond my accent or skin color. That's why I'm still studying 9 years later. Thank you.
So, on behalf of everyone here tonight, I'd like to thank you, Andrew, Natalie, Lucy, Mayen, and Atem, for your personal stories, for talking about personal tragedy, about difficulty, about resilience, and about hope. And I think what you've really spelt out for us, is that the struggles for newly arrived refugees, over the decades, over the past 60 years, have been quite similar in many ways. That the struggles that you found in the 1950s are quite similar to the struggles found for newly arrived refugees today. And I think it leaves me with sort of mixed feelings about the sort of welcome that we offer. That Australia does offer a welcome and new opportunities for people who've struggled, but also there's quite a bit of work to be done, within our society to ensure that the welcome is not a qualified welcome. And I think, as I said at the beginning, our aim, is to understand more about the story of people who've come to the country as refugees. And I think, an important direction for the work of the Refugee Council and others is to do everything that we can to encourage Australian people to understand more about the experiences of people who've actually come to the country as refugees, to actually shift the debate from this pointless, destructive political debate that we currently have, to actually understand that Australia's involvement in refugee protection is about people. It's about supporting people who've lost everything, and it's about offering new hope, not only for people, but also new hope for our country. Thank you.